Hello everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's presentation of OTF Connects, Critical Thinking Here, There, and Everywhere with Usha James from the Critical Thinking Consortium. We're really happy you're able to join us tonight. We understand that the weather's been changing. It's been a little bit harder to sit down at your computer after perhaps a long day in the classroom, and you've got your own family's needs to attend to as well. And so on behalf of OTF and Syria Skirhan, who's the administrator and facilitator of the OTF Connects program, we extend our gratitude to you for participating tonight. And definitely we thank Usha for being here to present and share all her wisdom and knowledge around the critical thinking model that TC Squared uses, and how rich the opportunities are for learning in the classroom with it. And here we've got our map showing our distribution across the province tonight, which we do like to capture that information. And now I will move it along and pass things on over to Usha.
Thank you, Louise, and a huge applause. I'll do it at the beginning and I'll do it at the end for Louise, who is always fabulous at not only getting us organized, but welcoming everybody in a way that I hope people know how much we all appreciate that you're here and understand that you're taking your own time. So really want to make it most worth your while. So welcome everyone, and I would love to, it's great to hear how many of you have had some previous experience with the critical thinking framework. I think everybody, it's a green check from everybody, a couple of people who didn't put anything up, but I'm not sure whether that means that they don't have the experience or with the critical thinking framework, or maybe they just didn't find the check mark in time. I'm not sure. Anyway, I thought that we might simply go down or up the list, and everybody might take a moment with their mic to just introduce yourselves. We got a nice kind of a good-sized group that we can actually do this with. So maybe just your name, where you are from, and what experience you've had, if any, with the critical thinking framework. And of course, there was no prerequisite that you had any. So just for my interest's sake, so I know where sort of my starting point might be. So Carol, can I invite you to start us off? Your name, where you're from, and what's your experience with the critical thinking framework?
My name is Carol, and I'm from Waterloo, and I've attended some of these OTF Connect sessions on critical thinking and networking sessions within the board.
Thanks so much, Carol. And can you, what's your role in the school or in the school board?
I'm an elementary occasional teacher.
Great, thank you so much for joining us. And then we have another Carol, Carol number 1.
Hello.
Hello, would you like to introduce yourself? Where are you, what's your context, and what's your background?
Hi there. I'm Carol, I'm from St. Mary's, and I'm also an occasional teacher. And I just started occasional teaching, and I'm just learning about critical thinking. I don't have much experience with the model. Yeah, so I'm excited about tonight.
Thanks so much. Well, welcome. It's great to have you here. And I will ask everyone, when you're done talking, if you just click off your mic, then we won't have sort of that feedback loop that sometimes we get. Thank you. Okay, Chandani, is that right?
That's right. Hi, Usha. I have been to one of your summer workshops 2 years back, or 3 years back in Toronto, and that was just amazing, and I started using critical thinking in my classroom. I'm a grades intermediate teacher. It's just so engaging for my kids. I tried to look for more workshops. I couldn't find any, so I'm connected with you online.
Well, that's lovely to hear, and nice to meet you again. So thanks for coming. Debbie, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Debbie. I'm in Ottawa, and I'm currently in an LTO position for ESL for juniors. A previous LTO that I did last year, part of our focus in school was critical thinking. And we had somebody from the University of Toronto come to talk to us, and I can't remember his name, but he is, I think he does a lot of research into critical thinking. So we were trying to get that into our everyday teaching at the time.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, Debbie. Might have been Garfield?
Yes, that's it. Yes.
Yeah, my close colleague and longtime friend, and we have a number of people who work with us at the consortium and facilitate and consult with the Critical Thinking Consortium. So you may know Garfield Jeannie Newman. Some of you may know Laura Jeannie Newman, his wife. We have a number of people in the region, and we work across the country. And a little bit in the States and a little bit internationally too. So we're really a wonderful, strong team. So thank you, Debbie.
Okay.
And Elizabeth doesn't have a mic, but she wrote in the chat box there that she had some experience with an online session, Elizabeth, with Mary Abbott, who's actually out in British Columbia and who works with us at the consortium. And you're a teacher librarian, fabulous. Josette doesn't seem to have a mic either, but has told us in the chat box that she's a grade 8 immersion core French teacher in Ottawa. Hello, great to see you here, and thanks for that background. And Vera is writing, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure if she has the mic. I can't remember.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, great. Okay, so I was typing just in case. I wasn't sure if it would work. Actually, my laptop was stolen in Buenos Aires, and I'm just trying to get a new one set up with all the various software and stuff that one seems to need these days. Anyway, I'm an elementary teacher from Peel. I've also done some work with pre-service teacher ed in Toronto. And I'm just getting back from a year leave of absence, which I spent in Argentina with my girlfriend and 10-year-old twins. We were doing some volunteer work there and just kind of learning about the culture. Kind of an interesting place, actually. The teachers just turned down a 30% raise because the inflation rate there is nearly 40%.
Wow, that's quite something. Well, number one, that's terrible that your laptop got stolen. Number two, welcome home, and really interesting to hear the context of teachers in other places. Absolutely, and I can see that Elizabeth is also talking a little bit about thoughtful books and that you've used those. So that's fabulous. At the very end of the session, we'll just do a quick overview. If you haven't been on the TC Squared website, some of the materials that are available to you for free, and if you have an account, we can show you. So Vera, I'll walk through the thoughtful books a little bit and tell you a little bit about them for primary and junior students, and we will definitely go there. Now, I am very flexible, open to questions, happy when people sort of jump in and take us in a particular direction. So please feel free at any moment to throw a quick question into the chat box or raise your hand or get on the mic, whatever works best for you, as Louise said. But really want to make sure that, yeah, I might regret saying that, you're right, but I really want to make sure that whatever we do tonight kind of meets your needs and fits your context. So I didn't hear anybody sort of really talk about a particular grade level that they were focused on. I know that we have a couple of occasional teachers, but I would love to sort of see if there are certain grades you want to make sure that we talk about some very particular pieces for. So maybe in the chat box, is there a particular grade? Okay, intermediate 7-8, that's great. Thank you. Junior, yep. Grade 7, good, okay. Social justice, yes, okay. Okay, so it's a little bit tough to sort of add slides at the last minute, but I have lots of ideas, so we will definitely talk through those pieces, and I can direct you if we use an example how it might apply in different grade levels. Okay, so let's start. And I will sort of let you know ahead of time if you've had a bit of experience with the framework or an introduction to the framework. Then some of the things we'll do today will be a review, but I hope it's a useful review, and I've tried to bring newish examples that you may not have seen before. I'm thinking, given your background, that some of these may be new to you and hopefully useful. But please let me know if they will or will not work for you, and we can move along as quickly as we need to. Okay, here we go. So I thought today we would kind of focus on three main goals. Of course, we want to deepen our understanding of critical thinking, whether you're brand new to it or you've had it before. What I find is that it doesn't really matter how many times people have sort of heard even an introductory workshop. What we hope is that you get something out of it each time, and it sort of solidifies your understanding. Just like with students, there's no way we can teach them something once and suddenly they magically get it and can apply it also. So always want to review, refresh, refine, deepen that understanding. I really want to sort of talk about what it looks like and sounds like. So build a bit of your own schema about how do we know that critical thinking is happening in the classroom. And that's easier to do sometimes in a face-to-face session because you can sort of collaborate, think with each other, and see what it sounds like when people are thinking critically. But we're going to try to do that in this online session also. And we're really going to focus today not on the sort of large unit tasks, although we could do that another day, or the kind of long-term planning to support critical thinking, although that's obviously something that we talk about and work with teachers around. But today's focus is really on very practical ways, easy ways to tweak those daily questions and activities, and a particular focus on thinking about getting all students thinking simultaneously. Because it's one thing to ask a great question, but if we only have the same 2 or 3 hands going up all the time to answer it, then a lot of that gets lost, unfortunately. So that's our focus today. I would love to invite you, though, to add to our agenda or to sort of indicate if one particular part of that really resonates with you. So I'll invite you to give me a hand up or to write in the chat box. But I would love to hear your response to sort of our goals for the next hour or so. What would you like to add? Is there anything in particular that resonates for you? I see a couple of people writing. Yes, getting all students thinking is a difficult one. Okay, math and science at the grade 7 and 8 level. Okay. Vera, I have to admit I looked at the list of registrants and I didn't see much math, and for that reason I didn't put a lot of math in there. I didn't see any math actually, except for one secondary person who said they weren't coming. So I will point some stuff out, and I may just share my desktop with you and show you a few pieces. But there's definitely some things on the website that we can talk through. But I will make sure we talk about that. Few people still writing. Anything else that resonates with you? 30-minute periods, absolutely. That's what we're going to focus on, is quick and dirty, ways to invite thinking. Okay. Okay, thank you very much, folks. Please feel free to add and jump in. Sometimes the chat box goes so quickly that if I miss a question or a comment, feel free to put your hand up and just remind me. Okay, let's keep going. Let's start with a challenge. As if you've been in my workshops before or any of our workshops, you probably know that's a way that I like to start it, and we can unpack it in a moment. Okay, so here's what I'd like you to do. Here's a famous photograph. and probably more appropriate for intermediate or secondary than elementary, but I know it's appropriate for adults, so that's why I'm using it, okay? So here is your challenge. I would like you to write an informative caption for this photograph, but what I would like you to do is don't type or, nothing in the chat box yet. I just want you to think to yourself for 15 seconds. If you were to write an informative caption for this photograph, what might it be? Hello, Syria. Welcome. Okay. I'm going to say get ready, get that, go, and then I'd like you to just drop a few words or phrases or, a quick one sentence at the most into the chat box. What are your initial thoughts about what an informative caption for this photograph might be? If I can get everybody to sort of throw something into the chat box. Okay, and Carol is still writing. Okay, all right. So now here's the thing. I've just given you one sort of piece of evidence. This was actually a series of photographs taken by a professional photographer. So I'm going to show you two more photographs in the series, and I'm going to invite you to look for what might be minor changes in the details to see if they confirm or challenge your initial thinking. Okay, but before I do that, I want to just highlight one thing. So let's just do a little bit of explicit teaching around critical thinking vocabulary. I've asked you for a caption, and I think with a lot of people that I work with, they look at the word caption, they look at the word photograph, and sometimes they give me a headline. So instead of a headline, I want you to, which is sort of quick and snappy and highlights the photograph without giving too much information, what instead I'm looking for is an informative caption, okay? So something that would go below the photograph that explains what's happening in the photograph, okay? So here's the next piece of evidence after having given you a little bit of explicit teaching around what I mean by caption. Now, there's the first photograph in the top left, and the new photograph, larger. You can see that they are almost the same, but there are a few differences. So first, I would like to invite you to, you can either use the pen tool, which is the third one down, or you can use your clip art or point to something. I'd like you to point to one thing you notice that's different in the second photograph than in the first. So I started you off with a little bit of a circle. I don't know if you noticed that. If you pick up the pen tool and just circle or point to something in the second photograph that you notice is different than the first. It's right here. Okay, so we have a few people circling things. We have the girl's hand, We have different people in the picture that weren't there directly originally. We have the man's hand. Yes, something about the light. Is that perhaps what you're pointing to? It's sort of darker in the second picture than in the first picture. Okay. I'm going to show you one more picture in this series, and then we're going to try our hand again at an informative caption. But I'd like to do just a little bit more explicit teaching. So the teaching that the thing I would like to point out is that I'm not looking for any old caption. I'm looking for an informative caption. So I'm going to give you 3 criteria for an informative caption, and I'll write them right here on I'll write them on this page and then I'll transfer them to the next page, okay? So 3 criteria for an informative caption. Okay, number 1, an informative caption is comprehensive. So what I mean by that is that it addresses all 5 W's, as many as we can at any rate. So who's in the picture, what's happening, where is this picture photograph been taken, when is it, why is it happening, okay? Number 2, an informative caption is based on accurate observations. So you can't tell me that you think this is happening on the moon. That wouldn't be an accurate reading of the observation. Number 3, an informative caption is based on plausible but imaginative inferences. So what that means is that if you're inferring, I want you to make sure that it's based on accurate observations, it's plausible, and it's connected to what we know about the world, connected to our schema, but it's also based on imaginative inferences. So please don't say what everybody else would obviously say. So give us a little bit more, infer in a way that gives us what, most people would agree on, but a little bit more, perhaps be a bit imaginative, a bit creative. Okay, I'm going to pause. I'm going to show you the 3rd picture, and I'm going to invite you to put your caption in the text box, okay, whenever you're ready. So here's the 3rd picture in the series. Feel free to use the pen tool to circle any new sort of evidence. And when you're ready, I will give you the criteria again. When you're ready, feel free to start in the chat box. I am going to invite you to kind of talk a little bit on the mic afterwards, but feel free to start in the chat box. Okay, so we've got a couple of people writing. If you don't have a mic, we would love to see what you have to say. If you do have a mic, feel free to turn it on and let us know what you are thinking. Okay, thank you, Chandani.
Did you say that this was a series of photographs in a contrived situation or a natural setting?
Well, that would be something that you would have to draw a conclusion about because we don't know. So do you have any evidence that it is one or the other, spontaneous versus contrived?
I would infer that it's contrived because in the third photograph, the fellow on the left with the white hat that's been circled in yellow highlighter, if you look in the center photograph, he's right beside the couple, and now in the third photograph, he seems to be behind them again. So it's almost as though actors have been asked to stand in certain positions for perhaps a movie or something else.
Okay, interesting. Debbie, yes, please go ahead.
Well, it just looks like on the second photograph that the couple at the front, they look very much as though they were superimposed over perhaps an original photograph.
So you think that perhaps this is photoshopping in place, not even contrived?
Possibly, or maybe it's just my screen.
Okay. Okay, all right. Other thoughts? Huh, interesting. Other thoughts? We've got Chandani saying that this is his girlfriend. Originally, we had Vera saying grabbed the first woman he saw. So those are two quite different conclusions. Do we have any evidence that these two people know each other versus any evidence that shows that they may not actually know each other? What are your thoughts?
I think in the third photograph, the girl seems to have put her hand around the guy's neck, or at least it's on the upper side. So it shows that there's something mutual as opposed to being forced.
Okay, thank you. Any opposing arguments with different evidence that you would like to highlight? You think she's boxing him in the ears, Vera? Any evidence? She's pushing him away? What makes you think she's pushing him away? The way he's holding her, her left hand is clenched, okay? All right, a variety of pieces of evidence. Does this picture indicate that they know each other? Does it indicate that this is a staged photograph? Does it indicate that this is sort of a spontaneous and surprised moment? Is she being assaulted? We're not quite sure, are we? There were some things that we didn't seem to have much disagreement about. People said it was a sailor. Somebody said New York City. What makes you think it's New York City, I'd like to know. What evidence leads you to that conclusion? Anything in particular? Just to guess, okay. Some people in the past have thought that maybe this is Times Square. Having been there, they may have recognized that. Some people might notice the American flag up here as a detail. People did seem to say after the war, so there's a bit of background knowledge that you're drawing on there to think that this might be, you know, a victory parade of some sort. Okay, I'm going to pause there for a second, and I'm going to, let's use this to unpack what we mean by critical thinking. And for those of you who've sort of been in sessions before, you may be familiar with this, with the definition I'm about to show you. But this activity, I'd like to suggest, was an activity that required you to think critically. So let's just do a little bit of review. What do we mean by that? And then we can talk about a number of different examples. So here's the definition that we've used with the consortium for many years. We're using it with districts across Ontario and across the country and beyond. And I love this definition because to me, we all sort of have a feeling about what we think critical thinking is, but if we're not using the same language to talk about it, it can be quite a different conception of what we mean when we say we want kids to think critically. We all think it's important, but are we all talking about the same thing? So TC Squared defines critical thinking as the thinking through of a problematic situation. So I just want to sort of pause there for a moment and talk about what that means. A problematic situation is one for which there is no clear black and white, right or wrong answer. It's problematic because there are multiple plausible options. So that's a really key piece of what we mean when we talk about thinking critically. There are multiple plausible options. So if we go back to our picture, you can see how when I asked you to create an informative caption, there are multiple plausible options. It could be they know each other, it could be they don't. And there's evidence to support both. It could be that it's staged, it could be that it's spontaneous. There's evidence to support both. Now, I want to clear something up, especially for the math and science folks. We're saying multiple plausible options. Does that mean that when there is a right answer, you can't think critically about it? That's, I think, a misconception that often that we have, is that, well, in math, there's a right answer, so you can't really think critically about it. Or in science, there's a definitely right answer, but how can we think critically about it? I'm not suggesting that you think that, but I think that's a difficulty we encounter a lot in our own practice. In this case, this photograph was taken. There is a true story around it. We may or may not know what it is. In fact, I'll just let you in on something. This is a famous photograph. It is after World War II. It is sort of a homecoming parade of sorts, but there's quite a bit of controversy. When it first appeared in the media at the time, it was sort of billed under this, a sailor, greets his beloved or his girlfriend or something. But there's quite a bit of controversy over whether this is indeed two people who know each other, or it's a bit of an assault. But there is a right answer here because this actually did happen. So we just don't happen to know what it is. Similarly, in math, when there is a right answer, does that mean we can't think critically? Absolutely not. So there may be multiple plausible options about the answer, or there may be multiple plausible options about how to best arrive at the answer, or what the best strategy is, or whether the answer makes sense. So there are many ways in which to frame a critical thinking task, even when there is an answer in the end. The issue is, do we focus our attention and our assessment on getting the right answer, or on defending and justifying the way that I've come to arrive at it, or the plausibility of my answer? So it's a problematic situation. If we want to invite critical thinking in our classroom, we want to make sure that we frame problematic situations around the curriculum we have to teach tomorrow anyway. About what to believe or how to act where the thinker makes a reasoned judgment. That's the second part of the definition. And in that second part, we're really trying to distinguish between sort of an opinion that's based on a gut response and a reasoned judgment that's based on evidence and criteria. Sometimes we use those two words interchangeably, and it can cause some problems. And finally, critical thinking reflects the competent use of the intellectual tools for quality thinking. We're not going to go into those intellectual tools today, although you may have heard about them before, and we can save that for another session. But we do know that there are 5 intellectual tools that all kids, all teachers, all adults need if they are going to think critically. And that when we ask a great question and we get a superficial answer, or we have students who have difficulty engaging and thinking about the question, it's likely one of those tools where there's a gap. And once we know that, we can actually explicitly and intentionally teach for it. Okay, I'm going to pause there for a moment and just invite you to comment on that last activity in relation to this definition. Are there some things that resonate? How do you know that it was an activity that required critical thinking? What happened in your brain? Let's talk about some schema. How do we know when somebody is thinking critically? What are they doing? Lots of people typing, so I'll just wait for a moment. If they're making decisions, we might hear them thinking aloud. They're using criteria of some sort to make a reasoned judgment. They're using their schema and textual clues. You had to think about what makes a good or an informative caption. Why am I saying what I'm saying? Absolutely. So there's a few pieces of the puzzle. We want to build that schema so that we have some way to assess for ourselves in our classroom. Is this inviting some thinking? Is this having the effect I'm hoping it would have on the kids? Is it making them reach into their background knowledge or to look closely at the text in order to answer this question? Absolutely. Background knowledge and thick questions. I like that term. Okay, let's do another one. Primary example. Okay, so here's a primary example that's not dissimilar, and many of you may have seen it in classrooms, in primary classrooms. This was in a kindergarten classroom that I visited recently. A teacher, they were kind of, kids were interested in Canadian animals, so they were sort of following, you know, a path of inquiring into animals in Canada. And so the teacher had put up this picture and had covered it with sticky notes. And every day the kids were deciding which sticky note to remove in order to get some information, some evidence, in order to infer what is the animal. And then they were returning to their predictions. What is this animal? Once, you know, every time they did it, so every couple of days or once a week, however often that they were doing this particular activity. So I'm going to suggest that this is also an invitation to think critically, much for the same reasons that the previous one was. But I'd like to sort of just take it a step further. So why is this an invitation to think critically? Because it's a problematic situation. There are multiple plausible options, because every time I ask the child to predict, it could be one of a number of things. But remember, there is a right answer. Like, we are going to remove these sticky notes and something is going to be beneath it, and that's okay. But my focus is on the child's predictions and them using the evidence in the picture to justify those predictions. So it is a problematic situation where they do have to use reasoned judgment. So for both of those reasons, that's a critical thinking task in primary. Now the kindergarten teacher that I was working with, and this is where we start talking about how do these singular activities grow into tasks that may not be huge, but kind of daily tasks. How can we invite thinking? How do we follow up on that initial task or that initial question? So the initial question was here at the top. Draw a conclusion or make a prediction based on clues. So when we remove number one, they might, just see the leaves, and they might say, oh, this is the habitat of this animal, or look at the animal in relation to the size of the leaves once they open number 13 and say, oh, it must be a pretty small animal. Oh, look at the claws, etc. Once they've asked once, the next day they remove another Post-it note and invite the kindergarten kids, assess your yesterday's prediction based on new clues. So that's another critical thinking task. small, not a huge assessment piece, not kind of a big unit plan, and yet sort of a quick and practical way to extend the inquiry that started. And change your prediction so that it better matches the clues. Now in this particular case, the students were actually recording their predictions on little sticky notes. They had it up on a board on the wall next to their name. And I worked with a teacher who did something very similar. This teacher had them take down their old predictions and put up the new ones. I worked with another teacher who did something similar, but she wanted to leave up all of their predictions so they could see how their thinking had changed over time. And I think that's a real key. Hi, Chris, by the way. Hello. I think that's a real key in inviting thinking on a regular basis, is to have some sort of visual record of the flexibility of our thinking. How has our thinking changed? Look at what I thought before, and what do I think now? If one of the ways to, on a daily basis, invite students to think is to have something you return to all the time, every time you learn something new. Go back to it again. What do you believe now? Let's go back to it now. You've learned a little bit more. What do you believe now? And by keeping the previous thinking at the forefront, in a thought book, on the wall, wherever that might be, then an easy critical thinking task is to have students assess their previous thinking in light of new evidence. So I'll pause there for a moment. Any initial thoughts on the idea of keeping your thinking visible over time? Absolutely. A great way to introduce vocabulary and build on what they already know. I think often we have this issue with kids is that we move on from one topic to another, one lesson to another, and what we did yesterday evaporates out of the top of their heads somehow. And how do we keep that sort of previous knowledge and schema at the forefront and remind them that they have to keep using it? Absolutely. Okay, so just a quick and easy way to, sometimes it's difficult to come up with new critical thinking tasks every day, or questions that invite critical thinking that are different about the content. And so one way to do that regularly is to have something that you can return to throughout the unit and have them continuously reflect on and change their mind about. Okay. Keep going. So many of you have may be familiar with our 3 types of questions, and you may or you may not be, I'm not sure. So I thought I would revisit them here and review, but perhaps with some questions that you may not have seen before. So I'd like to sort of just reintroduce you if you've seen them before. We sort of suggest that all questions can be categorized into these 3 types. And it doesn't really matter. Questions you ask kids on the fly, questions in the textbook, questions on a test, they fall into one of these 3 columns. They're either type 1 questions, type 2 questions, or type 3 questions. I'd like you to take a minute, and in the chat box, could you please give me one characteristic of type 1 questions? What's one thing you notice about them? We have a few answers there. They're simple answers, yes. They're fact-based, yes. Rote learning, we can memorize, we can retell the answers. They're right there answers, absolutely all true, okay? When you think in Ontario about the achievement chart, many people say that these are questions that will allow us to assess knowledge of the 4 categories of the achievement chart: knowledge, thinking, communication, and application. Many people will say, oh, these are knowledge questions, type 1 questions. I think I thought that for a long time too, but I think I'm revisiting that because now I feel like I'm not sure all type 1 questions even allow us to assess knowledge. Like I can remember the definition of something and regurgitate it out on a piece of paper, and that doesn't actually mean I know it. Doesn't mean that I understand it. I can list causes because I've memorized them, but doesn't actually necessarily show that I know it. Now, I don't think all type 1 questions are, and I'm not saying type 1 questions are bad. There's a good place for type 1 questions. But absolutely not all type 1 questions really are kind of worth the assessment marks we give them, because they don't even often tell us whether the kids, at the very least, know it. So it's something to kind of be wary of, and when we're asking sort of type 1 questions to which there's an obvious right answer. What about type 2 questions? Can you put in the chat box one thing you notice about type 2 questions? Okay, there's choice, there's options, it's personal. Opinions are required, but type 3 questions have opinions too. So what's the difference between a type 2 opinion and a type 3 opinion? There's some difference there. And I think it may have come out. A couple of people typing there. Just wait for a second. So personal opinion. Type 3, you need some schema or some background knowledge or some evidence in order to evaluate it. Absolutely. So those type 2 questions are personal. They offer choice. And again, these are not bad questions. It's interesting that Elizabeth said it requires students to explain. And I think we often ask students to explain, but sometimes it's very difficult for students to explain why they like something. It's a personal preference. So type 2 questions are really focused on, what do you like? What would you prefer to do? What's your gut feeling about something? So sometimes I don't know why I'd like to do something or why I like something better. Why do I like vanilla instead of chocolate ice cream? I don't know. I just do. Sometimes we can't explain, but type 2 questions sometimes don't even lend themselves to explaining, which makes it very hard also to assess any of the achievement chart categories. Again, not a bad question. Type 2 questions are great to start off the unit, to get kids to connect to their own personal experiences, to provide an entry point into the curriculum, absolutely. But they're not inviting critical thinking yet. Type 3 questions are those that we call critical thinking questions, questions that invite critical thinking, that there is a decision to be made. You can't just describe. You can't just go on your gut feeling. You have to decide. You have to make a reasoned judgment. There's more than one possible option. So when we rank order those 5 causes, for example, there has, some people could say that this cause is, the most important. But somebody else could argue, no, that cause is less important than this one. And the evidence should be able to, support both of those justifications. So there are multiple plausible options. The evidence can support multiple justifications. You need to have some evidence, some schema. You can't just go on your gut feeling. So that's just a bit of a review. Now, there's one of these that I think is a bit muddy, though. It's a bit fuzzy that, does it really belong in this category? Is there one that stands out to you that doesn't quite necessarily fit here? Any that you had difficulty with? People often point to this first one, the compare and contrast. And I think that's because, and say, well, that's not really a type 1 question, because compare and contrast can, require some thinking. And I always say it depends. It depends. So if you imagine we're asking kids to use, say, a Venn diagram to compare and contrast, let's just draw one up here. Okay? If it's very obvious what goes in each part of the Venn diagram, if there's no question about it, these are things. So if we're, comparing two things and the similarities are obvious and the differences are obvious, then we don't really have a type 3 question. It's just a type 1 question. However, there certainly are times when the similarities have to be inferred and the differences have to be inferred, and that might make it a type 3 question. Or we might use a Venn diagram to simply, in a type 1 way, and then ask this type 3 question, are the individual similarities or differences significant? To kind of use the Venn diagram to then lead to another decision. So just a kind of a quick sort of reminder and overview of what you yourselves pointed out in the chat box. Those type 1 questions are factual recall. They definitely have their right to their answers, as somebody said. Those type 2 questions are personal preference, their gut response, emotional. There's no wrong answers. Everybody's answer is okay because it's your preference. But type 3 questions are how we're defining critical thinking questions. And that those are the ones that if we want to invite critical thinking, we're trying to ask. Okay. Now we've done a bit of review. Let's take a look at very simple ways to tweak a common question on a daily basis to invite critical thinking. So the first one we just talked about. How, instead of asking, when we were trying to get kids to compare, how are, A and B, whatever that is, similar and different, which is a type 1 question if it's obvious. We might ask, how similar, notice the difference, how similar or different are A and B? Are these two things very similar, somewhat similar, or not similar at all? So what I'd like you to do is take a moment, think to yourself, and then I'd love to hear it on the mic or in the chat box, your choice. Can you think of an example from a grade level that you taught this year or in previous years, or from a subject area that you've taught, where you could ask that first question? How similar or different are A and B? Not how are they similar, but how similar are they? Very similar, somewhat similar, or not similar at all? Can you think of a topic where you could ask that question? Give us the grade maybe and the topic. That would be great. Yes, Vera, go ahead.
Okay, so last year I was teaching grade 3, and we were reading some of the books. Oh, sorry. Last year I was teaching grade 3, and we were reading some of the books from Ethos Social Justice Begins With. Hear me?
We heard you right at the beginning, and then you cut out.
Okay, here we go. So last year I was teaching grade 3 and using some of the books from the Social Justice Begins With Me kit from ETFO. And towards the end of the year, students were coming up with their own similarities and differences between some of the books we read. And, so I was often guilty of that common question. Well, how is this book like the other one, or how are they different? And I love adding the how similar, how different are they? And, I think it just makes them think about, well, I think they just have to sort of rank, I guess. Maybe they could use even a Likert scale, but to justify why they're saying, I mean, even 3 or 4 books, which ones are most similar and why? Why are these 2 more similar than the other 2? What is it about those 2? That kind of thing.
That's a great tweak actually to that question. So which of these, if you had more than 2, are most similar and which are most different? And of course, you know, if it's very obvious, and it's, again, it's not a type 3 question, but when there's sort of, you know, it's fuzzy. You could argue that, you know, book number 1 and 2 are the most similar, and somebody else could argue, no, not really. The situations in book 3 and 4 are most different. Comparing seasons, okay, that would be great. And Josette, I love your idea. I've never actually thought of that one before. But we often think about in language learning, how do we invite critical thinking about the language? So actually looking at, you know, tenses, you know, how similar are they? How different are they? What are the key differences, etc.? So lovely, yes, thank you very much. Lots of ideas there. Okay, let's keep going. Oh, sorry, Chandani, go ahead. Chandani, you go ahead.
Oh, sorry. For the deeper thinking question, unless I ask them to justify, it's still a very type 2 question because it's just asking me how similar or different they are. Very similar, somewhat similar, or not similar. Unless I ask them justify or explain your thinking, it still is a type 2 question where I'm giving them choices.
You are absolutely right. So here's the piece. We can ask students a type 3 question. Okay, let's just go back one. I can ask students a type 3 question, and they might answer it in a very type 2 way. So although this sounds like a type 3 question, how similar or different are A and B, they may not be thinking critically at all. We are certainly going to get some students who just answer that type 3 question in a type 2 way. Oh, I think they're very similar and different. Why? I don't know, I just do. Whereas sometimes we ask a type 2 question and our really strong students answer it in a type 3 way. They weigh the factors, they make a decision, they consider all of the evidence. So if you're right in the sense that the question itself doesn't always mean that I've asked a type 3 question. Sometimes it can be answered in a very type 2 way. So there are a few things that we want to attend to, and that really comes to those intellectual tools. Is A, we want kids to justify using the evidence. We know students are thinking critically when they are using the evidence and it could be textual evidence, it could be details from what they heard, it could be their schema, when they're using evidence to justify their opinion. So you are absolutely right. And I would like to add to what you said, Chandani, too, is that we want all students thinking critically. So if I'm going to ask this question in class, and I say, would anybody like to tell me, and I get 1 or 2 or 3 hands up, if those kids answer and I ask them to justify their evidence, they may be thinking critically and nobody else. So there's kind of many pieces of the puzzle that you have to attend to. So yes, you're absolutely right. Thank you so much. Okay, so we have a few examples that are appearing in the chat box there and some questions. How similar is a quantitative judgment versus how similar are they is qualitative. Louise, do you mean, yeah, so sorry, how are they similar is sort of a list, right? How similar are they is the decision that they might make, okay? Absolutely. Okay, let's do the next one. I want to keep going here. And we won't get through all of these, but I'm going to show you where you can go to see this list and get some ideas. So when you consider another sort of thing we often have students do, particularly in intermediate, I think we do it in the younger grades too, but for those of you who are teaching grades 7 and 8, we often get students to consider impact. So what is the impact of something on something else? But I think we do it in primary, especially around behavior, to be honest. How did such and such affect so-and-so? You did this behavior or this action. How do you think that would affect so-and-so? What do you think what you said would affect, how that would affect your friend? But in intermediate, we may ask, how does this particular action affect, what's the environmental effect, for example, we might ask. Or if I, make this change in this, math question, or if I make this change in this design of a particular, something that we're building, how might that affect X, Y, or Z? Or in this history question, when this particular thing happened in history, what impact did it have? So a common way of asking that question is, how did A affect B? That asks for a list. It asks for a description. It doesn't ask for a decision. So one way to tweak it is, as we have here, did A affect or contribute to B? So is this a cause? Is B a consequence or not? Now, that's not a critical thinking question, again, if it's obvious, or if we want them to say, yes, it did, or we have it in our mind, one of the answers that we want them to say. However, if it's truly problematic, and some kids could argue it affected it, and some kids could argue that it didn't, then you've got a critical thinking question there. Or, if so, what was A's biggest contribution to B? So what about A had the greatest impact if there were multiple things that had an impact? So I'll ask you again, can you think of an example in your grade level or subject area? And how could you tweak that question? So in the chat box, or feel free to put your hand up and use the mic. Sorry, I'll repeat. So given this tweak for the second task here, considering impact, how might you tweak a question where you ask kids to think about whether A affected B? So whether this action, whatever that might be, affected some outcome. How could you tweak it to instead ask, did this action or this event have any impact on B at all? Yes or no? And make sure there were multiple. So did early settlers' arrival have an impact on First Nations? That would be a hard one to say no to. However, Vera, if we were to ask, what was the greatest impact of early settlers' arrival on First Nations? Absolutely, you got it. Because there were multiple impacts. So having to weigh which one had the greatest impact? Absolutely. Other ideas? I see a couple of people writing, but if you want to grab the mic, feel free. So I'll just disappear off my screen. In science, did something have an impact when something else reacted? Okay. Did the oil spill impact the water table? If so, what was the biggest effect? Interesting. Okay. Okay, neat. Neat ideas there. Okay, so the title of this slide says 10 tweaks for common questions. I'm going to point you where you can see the rest of the tweaks that are here as we go through kind of the next 4 slides, but we're not going to talk about them. I think I'll just show the slide, pause, let you come up with an idea in your head, and then move on. But I'll tell you where to find all the tweaks on a different resource. So let's just kind of move forward here. So similarly, how can we bump up brainstorming, which is something that we do often, from the common question? How many different ways can you think of to the following? Take a minute to read that. And fourth, whether it's reading a storybook to the kids or learning about an event in, current affairs, we can ask kids to describe an event or a character, which is not a critical thinking question, but a very small tweak. What are the 5 or 3 or 2 most important things to know about the character? Okay. Okay, so these 10 tweaks for common questions are available in a resource called Tips for Teachers. You'll find it on the TC Squared website, www.tc2.ca, under Professional Resources. So the tab of Professional Resources, there is a piece that's at the very bottom of that tab that says Tips for Teachers, and you'll find that there. So I will leave you to take a look at those on your own time, because I'd like to sort of, oh, thank you, Professional Learning tab, sorry. Because I'd like to sort of move on to a piece around building a classroom environment and some common everyday things that we can do to invite thinking in our classroom. So let's start here. There we go. Okay, so we can ask a great question, which is what we said at the very beginning. We can ask a great question, and yet we can only have a few kids answer. Or there may be a number of reasons why kids are not answering. So I'd like to think back to a time when you've been, as an adult, in a professional learning sort of environment. And I want you to think of a time, please don't tell us who the facilitator was or who the instructor or what the situation was, but I would like to invite you to think of a time when you were in a professional learning environment, when something that the facilitator or the instructor did squashed your thinking, undermined your thinking, versus something that the facilitator or the instructor did that prompted you to think. Okay, so we're going to talk about kind of many ways that we can absolutely encourage thinking. So what I would like you to do is to use the text tool. So that's right here. Oops. And use the text tool, and in the box, create a text box, and give us a thought. When has something that an instructor or facilitator done squashed your thinking versus encouraged or prompted your thinking? They were closed-minded. They said your answer was wrong. They didn't use wait time. They just read off the PowerPoint. When you're encouraged to think when someone responds to your question with a different question, okay? When they ask you what you thought and why. Other thoughts? A few people writing in the chat box, and a couple of people on screen. They piqued your curiosity. I'm going to guess that's where that's going. Thanks, Vera. No worries. Okay? When they encourage you to take risks and don't laugh at wrong answers, when you're given lots of time, when they ask you, when you're encouraged to follow your own inquiry, absolutely. And let's get a couple of last ones and then we'll go on. When you get to write things down, that's often helpful, isn't it? Okay, I'm going to pause there. I know some people might still be writing, but I'd like to suggest that there are very sort of quick, practical, easy things we can do in our classrooms every day that put us in the right-hand column that encourage and prompt our students to think. So we invite critical thinking by asking a great question, but there are lots of routines that we can put in place regularly to invite that. I'm going to move to the next slide. So somebody is still writing. Doing experiments, the ideas of others are validated. So I apologize for cutting you off if you were still writing, but I'm just going to keep going here. So there are a number of things we can do to create that community of thinkers in our classroom. And as we kind of come to the end of this year and are thinking forward to September, one of the things I'm talking to teachers about is what expectations should we kind of set in the classroom that are beyond behavioral expectations. We often at the beginning of the year sort of talk about behavioral expectations. Some of us use tribes. Some people talk about, respect is the sort of key behavioral expectation. I'd like to suggest that we add to our sort of our regular behavioral expectations some expectations that take the same sort of weight, have the same weight, but have to do with thinking. So imagine, for example, if one of these expectations went up on the wall in September and had the same sort of weight or importance as the other expectations we always put on our wall. Which of these two expectations, if you did that in September, do you think would have the most powerful effect on a classroom environment that you taught this year in terms of their thinking? You can give it to me in the chat box, or you can just use the check mark or put a little check mark in one of those boxes there. Which two expectations do you think might be most powerful? To make up their own minds? Yes, I think that's a key one. If students came in and said, when they came in, we said, in this class, everybody's going to be expected to make up their own minds. Whenever we do things, you're going to hear what people say. You're going to want to come and ask me what I think. Miss, what do you think? Miss, what's the right answer? But I'm going to constantly come back to you and say, you need to make up your own mind. Absolutely. Seriously consider other perspectives. Absolutely. Disagree and challenge. Now, we often focus on that in a respectful way, but imagine if we were to put up the expectation that everyone is expected to disagree and challenge. Now, for some kids, that's not where they have the difficulty. It's in the respectful way part. But everyone will be expected to disagree and challenge. That's what we're looking for. So something to think about in terms of a sort of a practical way to up the expectations of thinking in your classroom is to really be explicit about them and put them on the wall and give them the same sort of weight as we do other expectations. Something to think about for September. Similarly, there are a number of classroom routines and activities that we can do that will invite thinking regularly. So I'm going to go through a few of these. I'm conscious of the time. It's 8:51. So I'll go through a few. We won't get to all of them, but I'd like to sort of highlight a few that people are using and finding very powerful. So as a regular sort of practical strategy, one of the routines that many people are using is being conscious of using the vocabulary of thinking regularly. So what do we mean by the vocabulary of thinking? That's using words like evidence, justify, hypothesize, criteria, what's your argument? What facts support that argument? So when we use the vocabulary of thinking regularly, and more importantly, ask students to use the vocabulary of thinking, which is when we really know that they get it. So when we invite them, when they start talking, when they're justifying their answer, we might prompt them to say, could you just tell me which of those is your argument and which is your evidence? Or could you, point to a piece of evidence that another student has brought up that you find powerful or that you would like to challenge? When we use that, when we kind of up the ante on our language, we often up the ante in our thinking. So one of the routines people are using is in addition, to having a word wall of content words that people might put up on their wall about science or history or whatever it might be, to also have a word wall of thinking words. So every time we're sort of focusing on a particular sort of thinking word or a few, that goes up on the wall and something that students are always thinking about and referring to. I'm going to go forward. Regularly soliciting student ideas and suggestions. There's lots of ways to solicit student ideas and suggestions. I just want to show you one that I played with in my grade 10 class when I was teaching it that I found really interesting. I started putting a section on the test that invited students, this is sort of a separate page on the test, that invited students to respond appropriately and thoughtfully to questions about the unit. What topics do you think you'll remember the most and why? Which one do you think you'll have the most difficulty remembering and why? And if you could change one thing we learned about this unit, what would it be? So I thought this was really interesting because they actually had to articulate what they learned in the unit. They also had to recall how they learned it, and they were giving me specific feedback on what went well. Now, whether or not I should have put a mark on this, I'm not sure. So I don't hold this up as something ideal. However, by doing it regularly, I was inviting them sort of into thinking about how the unit played out, what worked for them, and what didn't, so that I could consider it for future units. Praising thoughtful responses. I think we go a long way with students when we shift both our assessment and what we refer to when we talk about their responses from focusing on getting the right answer to whether it was a thoughtful response. And students really notice that difference quite quickly. So it becomes the difference between, when we ask a question and the first student to put up their hand gives you the right answer, what are you going to do? You can move on and say thank you and as if everybody got it, or you can pause and ask for another response without saying whether or not that first response was right. It unnerves students right at the beginning, absolutely, but it sends the message that let's hear multiple responses. Your job isn't to guess what's in my head and seek my praise for getting the right answer. It's to offer a response and justify it, and we're going to listen to a number of different justifications and revisit our original thinking. So a number of different sort of things here. I won't go through all of them, but I will suggest there is an article on the website in a section called Critical Discussions that talks about how do we build a community of thinkers and what are some of those practical ways, such as these, to build that community of thinkers. So again, if you don't find it, pop me an email or take a look on the website and I'd be happy to send it your way. It's in the section of the website under Critical Discussions. I don't know if Louise is going to work her magic and put the link here or not, but if she doesn't, she's getting it. I knew she would be. Okay, we're getting close to the end here, so I'm going to just skip forward here. Hold on. To a last piece, okay? And we'll just spend a minute on it. Oops, where are we? Okay. So finally, we've talked a little bit about tweaks for our questions. We've talked a little bit about kind of routines and expectations that we can use to invite critical thinking on a daily basis. And the last thing I want to talk about is sort of the particular activities or graphic organizers and how we might bump them up. So we've talked about one already, the Venn diagram. And when we think about the Venn diagram, you know, we talked about how it might be compare and contrast, what's similar or different. But consider this. Imagine if I invited students to use Venn diagrams in this way. We are learning two concepts. Which of these diagrams best represents the relationship between the two concepts? Are they totally dissimilar with no overlap? Are there some similarities? That would be A. Are there some similarities and some differences? That would be B. Or is one a subset of the other, i.e. it has all the characteristics of the other, but the other has some characteristics that the first doesn't have? Notice the shift in this simple graphic organizer and now how students might now have to make a decision. Okay, so I might say to you, which of these Venn diagrams best represents the relationship between sports and hobbies? I'll just pause for a second while you think about that. Are they totally dissimilar? Are they somewhat similar? Or are all sports hobbies, or are all hobbies sports? So I won't ask you to respond looking at the time, but I will say I hope you can see the difference between asking kids simply to fill out a Venn diagram or to select which diagram best represents the relationship between two concepts. Similarly, we often use pros and cons charts. How might we bump this up? It might simply be by adding a section at the bottom that says, now that you've listed the pros and the cons, which, you know, kind of is most compelling? Should we take action or not? So simply adding the decision at the end bumps up common sort of instructional strategies. And finally, the last one I want to sort of talk about and then we'll end is we often, some of us may use a placemat activity to have students brainstorm in their own section. So here's a piece of chart paper with 4 kids sitting around it, and we may say to kids, brainstorm in your own section something. And then in the middle, see what you have in common. That's not a critical thinking activity. It's a very type 1 way to use this activity. Simply look at what we all had in common and put it in the middle. Whereas we could ask kids, rank order of the things you had in common, what's the most important? Or you might say, categorize. So look at all of your individual brainstorms and come up with 2 or 3 categories. So there's a number of different ways to tweak individual instructional strategies so they too invite critical thinking on a regular basis. Okay, I'm going to flip forward here. And I'm just going to remind you, if you haven't been to the 2C Squared website, this is what it looks like. We do encourage everybody to sort of go to the top right and log in and register, create an account for yourself. If you are part of a partner board, then you, a board that has paid partnership fees, become a partner that we work with closely. You already have access, as long as you create a register for an account under your board email, to all of the resources. If you're not part of a partner board, you can become an individual member. But either way, I strongly suggest that you go and take a look at the website. There's lots of free resources also. And if you log in and register, there's emails that will be sent to you with ideas, etc. I hope that's been useful, folks. I find it amazing how quickly an hour and a half goes by, for me at any rate. I hope it didn't drag for you. I hope it was useful, and that there are pieces there that you found practical and effective and will help you, you know, tomorrow or the next day in addition to in September. So thank you so much. I would love to hear your final thoughts in the chat box or in the mic as we sort of sign off here. And I wish you the best of luck. Please do feel free pop me an email or get in touch with us or take a look at the website. It's been lovely to spend the evening with you. Thanks, folks.
Thank you so much, Usha. You really, I think, pushed everyone's thinking tonight in a very thoughtful way. And thank you also for sharing the useful and free resources that are available on the TC Squared website. I think this is a great opportunity to share here tonight. I too would like to thank everyone for giving of your time to join us tonight and participate in the chat. Lots of interesting comments went by. I would encourage each of you, I know Louise will put up a slide, the final slide with the feedback link. I would really encourage you to give us your feedback. We're nearing the end of our program for the 2013-14 year, and we're looking at developing the program for next year, so your feedback is very, very important. We will be sending a survey at some point next week to get your feedback about what the needs are for next year. There are only 2 sessions left, one tomorrow night, and tomorrow night's session is supporting the revised social studies curriculum, and it with the inquiry focus. So really concentrate on using inquiry to deliver the new curriculum. The resource was developed OTS in collaboration with the Social Studies Association, so it will be a very relevant resource, and I would think a really useful session for those of you that are teaching in the elementary level and teaching the new curriculum, which I guess everyone will have to do come September. Next week, our very last workshop is on June 5th, Coming of Age in the Digital Age, with Shanna Burns and Ryan Brewer from the 4th R. So I would encourage you to sign up for those workshops and do pass the message along to your colleagues to register or to look into those workshops. One more thing. For the first time since 2011, OTS is hosting Summer Institutes again this year, and registration is now open. So there's all sorts of fabulous workshops, 3-day workshops across the province, and of course Louise has the slate up already. So thank you all. Usha, thank you so much for giving of your time to join us tonight. I know how busy you are, so we truly appreciate when you can share some of your very valuable time with us. And thank you all. And Louise, thank you. Louise always makes things run so smoothly. She never panics. Thank you all and good night.
Thanks, both folks. Thank you so much, Syria. And Louise, you're my hero as always. And have an excellent night, folks, and best of luck. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Usha.